Chapter 33. General Hascam trotted his horse along the front rank of his army, watching for the first skirmish party make their way back to his lines. He had lost perhaps 200 men, killed and wounded in that first encounter, he estimated, and perhaps half that number of horses. With an army of 6,000 combat troops, of course, the numbers in themselves weren't terribly significant. What was significant, however, was the behavior of the Scandians. That first attack had been designed to reduce their numbers by several hundred, not his own. In fact, there had even been the slight hope that the majority of the Scandians might have been drawn out from behind their defensive positions into the exposed ground where they could have been easy meat for his mounted archers. He reined in as he came level with a group of his officers. Among them he recognized Colonel Binzak, his head of intelligence. The colonel was looking decidedly uncomfortable, he saw, as well he might be. Hascam caught his eye now and jerked his head toward the Scandian defenses. "That is not what I was led to expect," he said. His voice was deceptively mild. The colonel urged his own horse forward a few paces and saluted as he came level with his commander. "I don't know what happened, Shan Hascam," he replied. "Somehow they seem to see through the trap. It's not the way I expected them to react. It's—" He searched for the right words, finally saying weakly, "It's totally un-Scandian behavior." Hascam nodded several times. He held his anger in with effort. It was undignified for a Temujai commander to show emotion on the field of battle. "Does it occur to you, perhaps," he said eventually, when he was sure he could keep control of his voice, "that the Scandians may have someone with them who knows our way of fighting?" Binzak frowned as he turned his thought over. In truth, it hadn't occurred to him, but now that the Shan had mentioned it, it seemed the logical conclusion, except for one factor. "It would be unlike the Scandians to give field command to a foreigner," he said thoughtfully. Hascam smiled at him, but it was a smile without the faintest touch of humor in it. "It was unlike them to break off their pursuit, form a shield wall, and then hit us with a surprise attack from the woods, too," he pointed out. The colonel said nothing to that. The truth of the statement was self-evident. "There have been reports," the Shan continued, "that a foreigner has been seen with the Scandians. One of those cursed Atabi." Atabi, literally meaning the green ones, was the Temujai term for rangers. In the years since Halt had made his successful horse raid, the Temujai leaders had attempted to gather as much knowledge as they could about the mysterious force of men who wore green and gray cloaks and seemed to meld into the forest. In the past few years, in preparation for this campaign, spies had even reached as far as Araluan itself, asking questions and seeking answers. They had learned little. The rangers guarded their secrets jealously, and the ordinary Araluans were reluctant to discuss the ranger corps with foreigners. There was a strong undercurrent of belief among Araluans that rangers dabbled in magic and the black arts. Nobody was too keen to discuss such matters. Now, as this attention of an Atabi among the enemy, Colonel Binzak shrugged. "They are only rumors, Shan," he protested. "None of my men could confirm the fact." The general's gaze locked on his. "I think we've just had it confirmed," he said, holding the colonel's eyes until the other officer looked down and away. "Yes, Shan," he said bitterly. He knew his career was finished. Hascam now raised his voice, addressing the other officers gathered around, and dismissing the matter of the disgraced intelligence colonel. "It might also explain why our own planned surprise attack from the ocean failed to materialize," he said, and there were a few assenting grunts. The plot with Slegor had been hatched by Binzak. Now it seemed the 150 men who had embarked on the Scandian ships 4 days ago had simply vanished into thin air. The general came to a decision. "No more subterfuge. We've wasted enough time here. We've been delayed by 3 weeks already. Standard attack from now on. Rolling arrow storm until we create a weakness. Then we drive through their line." The commanders nodded their assent. He looked around at them, seeing their determination, their grim confidence. The Temujai were about to do what they did best, using their mobility and the devastating force of their mounted archers to probe and weaken the enemy line. Then, when the moment was right, they would drive in with their sabers and lances and finish the job. There was no shouting of battle cries, no histrionics from the men. This was a normal day at work for them. "Give your orders," Hascam told them. "Watch for my commands." He wheeled his horse, ready to ride back to the knoll where he would set up his command position. Already signal flags were beginning to order the standard assault. A voice from behind him made him pause. "General!" It was Benzak. He had forsaken the social honorific of Shan. Hascam noticed, and addressed him by his military title. The general faced his intelligence colonel now, waiting for his next words. "Permission to ride in one of the Ulans, sir," Benzak said, his head held high. Ulan was the Temujai word for the formation of 60 riders that was the basic unit of the Temujai force. Hascam considered the request. Normally, field-grade officers were kept out of the close contact part of battles. They had no need to prove their courage or dedication. The general finally nodded permission. "Granted," he said, and spurred his horse back to the command position. "Now what?" said Ragnak irritably, as he watched the Temujai cavalry forming into groups. Halt watched too, his eyes narrowed. "Now, I think, it's the end of our opening gambits. Now that they're going to hit us in earnest." He pointed with his bow, sweeping it along the line of mounted horsemen facing them. "They'll fight in their Ulans, 60 men in each unit, hitting us all along the line and wheeling away before we can respond. The idea is to pick off as many of our men as possible with arrows before launching a concentrated attack at a selected spot." "Which is where?" Eric asked. This tactical talk was making him increasingly cross. All he wanted was a dozen or so Temujai within his axe reach. Now it appeared he would have to continue waiting for that eventuality. Halt turned to the signaller with a horn. "Give the ready call to the archers," he said, and the man blew a series of long, short notes. He replied to Eric's question. "Wherever the general decides they've created a weakness in our line." "So, what we do while we're waiting for him to make up his minds?" Ragnak asked irritably. Halt grinned to himself. Patience certainly wasn't high in the Scandian list of virtues, he thought. "We surprise them with our own archers," he said, "and we try to kill as many of them as we can before they become used to the fact that someone is shooting back at them." All of Will's 100 archers heard the horn signal, and there was an instant stirring among them. He held up a hand to calm them down. "Stay down," he called. He took his time and was pleased that his voice didn't crack. Maybe that was the answer for the future, he thought. He climbed up on the raised step that had been built into the command position. Horace, his shield ready, stood beside him. The wicker breastworks still concealed their archers, but when the time came they would be pushed aside and the shield-bearers would have the responsibility of protecting them from the answering storm of arrows that the Temujai would send their way. Below Horace and Will's more exposed position, protected by earthworks and a wicker overhang, Evanlyn crouched in her position, with a clear sight of the line of archers. The assembled troops of horsemen began to move now, cantering slowly at first, then at increasing speed. Will could see that this time each man was armed with a bow. They thundered toward the Scandian line, not in one extended line as they had before, but in a dozen separate groups. Then 100 meters from the Scandians, each group wheeled so they were heading off in a dozen different directions and sending volley after volley of arrows arcing up over the Scandian lines. Will drummed his fingers nervously on the breastwork before him. He wanted to see the Temujai pattern before he committed his men. The first surprise would have the maximum potential to disrupt the enemy, and he wanted to make sure he didn't waste it. Now there was a continuous rattle as the raised Scandian shields caught the majority of the arrows that the Temujai were pouring in. But not all. Men were falling along the Scandian lines and being dragged back out of the battle line by those behind them, who then stepped in to replace them. Now the second and third ranks of Scandians held their shields high to protect them against the plunging fire, while the front rank presented their shields to the more direct frontal fire. It was an effective ploy, but it left the men blinded to the approach of the Temujai. Now as Will watched, one group of 60 quickly slung their bows, drew sabers, and darted into the Scandian line in a slashing attack, killing a dozen men before the Scandians even realized they were there. As the Scandians reformed and moved to counterattack, the Temujai withdrew rapidly, and another Ulan, waiting for this exact opportunity, poured a deadly hail of arrows into the disrupted shield wall. "We'd better do something," Horace muttered. Will held his hand up for silence. The seemingly random movements of the Temujai Ulans actually had a complex pattern to them, and now that he had seen it, he could predict their movements. The horsemen were wheeling again, galloping away from the Scandian line and back to reform. Behind them, more than 50 Scandians lay dead, victims of either the arrows or the slashing Temujai sabers. Half a dozen Temujai bodies lay around the breastworks where the Ulans had made their lightning attack. The Temujai riders were back on their own lines now. They would rest their horses, letting them recover their wind, while another 10 Ulans took up the attack. It would be the same pattern, forcing the Scandians to cover up behind their shields, then attacking with sabers when they were blinded, and finally pouring in volley after volley of arrows as their own men withdrew, leaving a gap in the shield wall. It was simple. It was effective. And there was a deadly inevitability about it. Now the Ulans began their wheeling, galloping dance once again. Will fixed his attention on a troop in the middle of the line, knowing that he would curve and turn eventually, coming at him on a diagonal. He muttered to Horace, "Get those breastworks down." He heard the muscular apprentice bellow, "Shields! Uncover!" The shield-bearers rushed to shove the wicker walls down, leaving the archers behind a waist-high earth berm and with a clear field. "Ready!" called Evanlin, indicating that each man in the front of the archers had an arrow knocked to the string. Then it was up to Will. "Half left!" he called, and the archers all turned to the same direction. "Position 2!" 100 arms raised to the same angle as Will watched the approaching group of riders, seeing in his mind's eye the galloping Temujai and the flight of arrows converging to meet at the same point in time and space. "Half a draw! Draw!" The elevation corrected, and 100 arrows came back to full draw. He paused, counted to 3 to make sure he wasn't too soon, then yelled, "Shoot!" The slithering, hissing sound told him the arrows were on their way. Already the archers were reaching for their next shafts. Horace, about to call for the shield-bearers, waited. They were under no direct attack at the moment, and there was no need to disrupt the sequence of shooting and reloading at this stage. Then the first volley struck home. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was the result of weeks of practice, hour after hour, but Will had directed that first volley almost perfectly. 100 shafts arced down to meet the galloping Ulan, and at least 20 of them found their targets. Men and horses screamed in pain as they crashed to the ground, and instantly the disciplined, structured formation of the Ulan was shattered. Those who were unhurt by the arrows were confronted by their comrades and their horses tumbling and rolling headlong. And as each stricken man fell, he took another with him, or caused his neighbor to swerve violently, reining his horse in, sawing on the reins until the tight formation was a milling mass of plunging horses and men. "Ready!" called Evanlin. From her position, she couldn't see the result. Quickly, Will realized he had the chance now to deal a devastating blow to the enemy. "Same target, position 2, draw!" He heard the scrape of arrows against bows as men drew back their right hands until the feathered ends of the shafts were touching their cheeks. "Shoot!" Another volley hissed away at the tangle of men and horses. Already Will was yelling for his men to reload. In their haste, some of them fumbled, dropping the arrows as they tried to knock them. Wisely, Evanlin decided not to wait until they had recovered. "Ready!" she called. "Same target, position 2, draw!" They had the range and the direction now, and the Temujai troop was stalled, caught in one spot, losing their most valuable protection, their mobility. "Shoot!" yelled Will, not caring that his voice cracked with the excitement. And a third volley was on its way. "Shields!" bellowed Horace, shoving his own shield forward to cover himself and his friend. He had seen that some of the other Uhlans had finally noticed what was happening and were riding to return fire. A few seconds later, he felt the drumming of arrows against the shield, heard the rattle as they struck the other shields along the line of archers. There was no way that the Temujai could send a squad with sabers in toward the archers. Halt had placed Will and his men to one side and behind the Scandian main line of defense. To reach them, the Temujai would have to fight their way through the Scandian axemen. The troop that Will had engaged had taken 3 carefully aimed volleys, nearly 300 arrows, in quick succession. Barely 10 men of the original Uhlan remained alive. The bodies of others littered the ground. Their riderless horses were galloping away, neighing in panic. Now as the other riders wheeled away toward their own lines, Will saw a further opportunity. Another 2 Uhlans were riding in close proximity and still well within range. "Shields down," he said to Horace, and the warrior passed the message along. "Target, right front, and a half. Position 3. Draw." Again he made himself wait to be sure. "Shoot!" The arrows, dark against the clean blue of the sky, arced after the withdrawing cavalry. "Shields!" Horace called, as the arrows struck home and another dozen or so Temujai tumbled from their saddles. Behind the shelter of the big rectangular shield, he and Will exchanged grins. "I think that went rather well," said the apprentice ranger. "I think it went rather well indeed," the apprentice warrior agreed with him. "Ready!" called Evanlyn once more, her gaze fixed on the archers as they fitted arrows to their bowstrings. The call reminded Will, a little belatedly, that she had no way of knowing how successful their first action had been. "Stand down!" Will called. There was no point in keeping the men tensed up while the Temujai were reforming. He gestured to Evanlyn. "Come on up and see the results," he told her.